Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world.
Nelson Mandela, when I think about him as an individual, I always think of freedom because of what he stood for. He stood for the fact that, and like Martin Luther King and others, that we should always judge people really by the content of their hearts and not the color of their skin. And if you ever look at his statement in the dock before he was sentenced, he talks about an ideal in South Africa where people are treated equally and where there's democracy and there's freedom for everybody. And he even said it's an ideal that he was prepared to die for. And so I always think about freedom and what he brought to South Africa because he stuck to his principles and eventually, apartheid fell and we all got the opportunity to vote. One day, President Bill Clinton, who was still the President of the United States, was visiting. And again, I think this just shows how Nelson Mandela was so forward-thinking. And so he says to Bill Clinton, I was present, he says, I want to introduce you to a very, very important man. And I'm thinking, who is this more important man that he's talking about? So he goes to the kitchen and fetches the chef's 6-year-old son. And he says, I want you to meet this very, very special man. And Bill Clinton shook his hand. So at that particular point, I and others thought, I think he's losing it now. And we didn't quite realize the magnitude of what he had just done. And I think what he was trying to tell us all was that the children, young people are the future and that we must not ignore and neglect them. And so he would rather bring a child to meet the president and, show the importance of the future generations. And so he believed in younger people. He would always spend time, whenever we visited anywhere, he'd want to talk to children and young people first. If we went to a restaurant or a hotel, he would want to meet the cleaners first and the staff and management last. Go into the kitchen and shake everybody's hands. And I would often joke with him and say, well, are you trying to make sure that they don't poison us? And he would laugh. And so that's the sort of person he was, He really believed in almost what we would probably term the underdog. He would always make time for people and he would make you feel important and special. That's what everybody who had met him said.
Well, my link with Nelson Mandela, it's quite an interesting story because Nelson met Lady Anya Sainsbury, who was a prima ballerina in the Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet. And he met her when he came out of prison, and they met at a party. And one thing led to the other, and they spoke, and they set up a scholarship for South African dance students to come to London to the Rombair School of Ballet and Contemporary. And I was one of the last students that came over on that scholarship program. And it's because of that friendship and that moment that they sat next to each other at that party that allows me to be sitting here today in Portsmouth, in the UK. So it's a really unlikely connection that I have with him. But I have to be thankful for what he did, because I wouldn't have my career today if it wasn't for that one little encounter from that party. So you never know who you're gonna meet and what can happen from a chance encounter. Yeah. Nelson Mandela means, to many people, he means different things. To me, it's his hope. The fact that he was willing to fight for something he believed in, and he said he was willing to die for the thing that he fought for. Now, if you have anything inside of you that you really want to achieve in your life, and you look at what this guy went through, and not just one guy, him and many others, hundreds of others who struggled and fought against oppression, they really put their lives on the line because they really held on to this thing. And for him to hold on for all that time, 27 years in prison, you would just give up. Why would you still want to come out and fight, you know? And what is really interesting is when he came out of prison, you would think that he would have animosity or resentment or anger, or a sense of wanting revenge on the people that put him into prison. But he came out like this, you know? And of course, all through life, we are challenged by people, and we face adversity, and we have enemies. And how we respond to our enemies, we have the choice to respond like for like. But the way he responded when he came out was in an embrace. Let's work together. Let's find a way that we can overcome these obstacles. And the thing that he said, you know, in life, you strive to climb this mountain or this hill. And then once you reach the summit, you only realize you've got many, many more to climb. He would come up with the most incredible sentences or sayings. And one of the things that I always hold on to is that life is like this, is that you will always fall. You can almost expect that you're going to fall, but it's not falling or failing, but it's how you get up. So there's so many things that he can mean to me, and it's not one thing.
We need to remember Nelson Mandela because he was the first black president of South Africa and believed in rights for everyone.
He risked 27 years in prison just to try to change the course of history so then everyone could be accepted.
He said education is the most important thing for children, both black and white.
He believed in justice for everyone.
Nelson Mandela got put in prison for his beliefs when he wanted to make white and black people equal, and so that's kind of a big part of him, and peace and that lot, so it's really nice.
I think he was a leader who demonstrated incredible dignity and incredible passion for his cause, but the way that he approached it in terms of peaceful means and his determination, I think, is an exemplar for other leaders in all walks of life, not just political leaders, but even people like myself that are running universities and so on. I think being able to show that determination, steely determination, that passion for a cause, but also that dignity and respect of other people, which I think was evidence. And also his approach to, I think, reconciliation and forgiveness is also something that I think in all walks of life, I think we could learn a great deal from. Well, I think the big message is that all people are equal and should be treated equal. And I think that is the overarching message, and those prejudices that people have historically or whatever have to be challenged. And it is not good enough for us to accept past norms that might in fact not be appropriate or might cut across human dignity, respect and equality.
I'm often asked who my political hero is, and I think that Nelson Mandela is someone that really is a political hero for me. I think what he did over decades of struggle and ended up achieving what we always wanted to achieve, I think is a huge achievement and someone that I've taken inspiration from. I think what he means to me is someone that's really stood up for what they believe in. He's a conviction man, he's someone that actually says we've got more in common than that which divides us, and I think that's a hugely powerful message even in today's society, and something that we can all take strength from. I think Mandela's message to the world is one of resilience and perseverance. The fact that he struggled for so long for his country and for people, and the fact that he persevered and continued and showed huge strength and leadership is a real message for the world.
Nelson Mandela is a very big politician. My link with him is that as an African from the same continent. And there's been a lot of stories about him being in prison and how he came out of prison to support his people in South Africa. Not just South Africa, but the whole of Africa. Yeah. His message to the world is love. Love your neighbor as thyself.
My link with Nelson Mandela is that I was born in Sophia Town and grew up in Meadowlands in Soweto, which is about 3-4 miles from where Nelson Mandela lived with his wife, Winnie Mandela, in Orlando West. So that is the link, and we are South Africans, both South Africans, and grew up under apartheid. And with my generation, was the normal way of life, living under apartheid. Yeah.
I'm Dudu. That's my name, Dudu Ndlovu, a South African, a product of apartheid. I was born and I grew right in the middle of that era where Mandela and the others fought this unjust system of apartheid. So that links me really with him. That's how I got to know about Mandela, because of the apartheid on South African people.
Lovely. Okay. What's Mandela been to you? And obviously what you'll talk about now is really about the system of apartheid that he was fighting, and that you yourselves, of course, were experiencing. So you'd like to sort of talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's because when we were growing up, Nelson Mandela was listening to the radio, the news. He was terror. He was a violent man. He was a dangerous man. And they used to use the word "le communisi," which is a communist. So that's how we knew him
at first.
First, when we were growing up. We didn't know him that well. Is what we had, and then now we've realized that he was a man of peace. All he wanted their South Africans to live together and be treated equally. And he didn't say, black people, you are better than the white people, or the white people are better than the black people. He just wanted unity.
Yeah, that's true. As children, we were really scared. The name Mandela just struck fear into our hearts, because that's what we were taught, by the white regime, that this man is no good, he's a terrorist. Try and avoid, anything to do with him. He was a really bad and nasty person when we grew up, But growing up and, speaking to people and just growing up, we got to know the other side, the true side of the story, that this man is fighting for our sake, fighting all these oppressive rules which were imposed on us. So everything changed then. We started perceiving him as what he was. And to us, he was a really peace-loving man, But, because that didn't work, he tried to resolve this thing peacefully, but it didn't work. He just had to change, to violence. Because really you can't, that's the only way. You can only fight fire with fire. Otherwise, he was really a peace-loving person.
Yeah.
Would you like to each of us tell me an experience you had which illustrates the harshness, the evil of the apartheid regime? Like, tell us.
Oh, yeah. All I can remember is the fear all the time that the police can enter the house anytime and arrest someone because that person is a communist or a terrorist.
And the police in other places like here, if anything happens, you run towards the police.
Yeah.
But in South Africa,
we were running away from them.
Police.
Yeah, because we were really...
And they were all white at the time.
At the time, And the black policemen that we had in the township, they just did what they are told, and they would shoot the children, and they were instructed to go and collect the bodies. You see them, that was their jobs, collecting dead bodies on the ground. So those dark days, it was really, and we had people who, the likes of Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela.
Yes.
Those are the people who kept us going and saying, they had songs about Nelson Mandela and all of them, like Sobukwe and all of them who were in prison. They had songs about that, and those, they kept us going, even though we couldn't listen to them, could we?
Yeah,
We had to. They were all banned. They were hidden, and we had to pinch them when their parents were at work to listen to them. And then hearing all those words, they were a real comfort to us.
Oh, well, since I was young, I've been listening to the story all through the African, where I was growing up, how the politics were in South Africa. And then, and when he was sort of put in prison for fighting for freedom. And that's what those I remember ever since I was young, and I used to think, oh gosh, what an amazing man, how can do that for everybody? So, and I thought, all that time, I thought, he was really a brave person, not just up for the country, like African country, when they were being dictated by different race, and no, you can't be yourself, and you can't do what you want to do to your race, which is and I thought, to me, although I come from a different part of Africa, that was different. But we're going to the shop, everybody shopped the same shop, you didn't have, so that segregation said you can't go there because you're black, and you can't shop there because you're black. And or us as the younger people, we find that wasn't right. Although I wasn't old enough to remember, but we follow that because all the village were talking about it, and everybody was thinking, oh, that was a brave man. Why were they put in prison for what he believed? People should be free. It should be freedom. People should be able to say what they want to say. Should be able to, especially when you can't vote in your own country. As I look upon him as a person, you could say, if everybody who was being treated the same as he was, should be somebody out there to do something about it. It was that person who went out of his way, not on his own, he had his followers there, just to do things to stop the people being being treated the same as they were.
Endurance, forgiveness, and pride in yourself as well. And that's determination that if you want something and you work out for it, you might be able to achieve it sometimes. To the whole world is tolerance. To have the thought that everybody is a human being, that no one should be more superior than the other. Yeah. And that we're all created by the same being. You know. Yeah. And what his tolerance and what he means to me is that being an African, I'm from Nigeria, when we had a civil war, when Ojukwu was forgiven for creating a war in Nigeria, and when he was forgiven, there was people were saying, no, you have to fight. This is exactly what Mandela has done. So it brought that home to me, that I have been in a situation where everything was forgiven without any repercussion. That's what I take out of Mandela's life more than anything else.
My link with Mandela is someone that I've always admired, many years, especially when he came out of prison and decided to forgive people when I was expecting to be a bloodbath, a retribution for what's gone on in his life and his broken marriage or broken family life. And he comes in and says, I forgive everybody. I want to work for the good of the country. I couldn't believe it. He was, from that day on, was its top of my hero list.
Yes. When we interviewed Stephen Morgan on Friday, he was one of his political heroes, and again for the same reason.
Mm.
What does he mean to you, Nelson Mandela, to you personally?
For me, someone I feel I have to emulate, copy his way of living, his ideals in the world, to work together with everybody, irrespective of ethnicity, gender, faith, whatever, for the good of the community. He has that empathy for others, to educate children, that children have a right to be educated, and I totally agree with that. He's someone I'd like to copy. I could never be like him. He's too forgiving and I'm not. He embodies everything I think a human being should be.
Terrific. Great. What do you think his message to the world is?
Live in peace. Accept each other. Respect each other. Work together for the good of the world. I just love to see him in that courtroom talking about his ideals and ended up saying, I am prepared to die for it. I thought that was someone who's prepared to give his life for the good of others, not just himself, but for the good of his country, people.
I was, number one, a white South African, young enough to be his son. He's the same age as my father. In fact, they'd both been 100 years old this year. I'd been an officer in the South African Defence Force, the military, the Navy. And so I thought, well, go to the island and at least I'll see the island and the prison. And I was surprised because when I was taken into a room where he and 4 or 5 other of the top prisoners were, this man, I didn't recognize him, shook my hand and said, curtly, straight to the point, the name is Mandela. You're very welcome. How's the sea? How was the sea? Because it can get quite rough going to Robben Island. And how's your father? And I said, well, Dad's fine. The sea was fine, and thanks for the welcome. I was so overwhelmed, I can't remember the order that I answered him in. And I was always puzzled as to this, how's your father? Because I knew my father had never met him, and I knew he'd never met my father. But I heard, in fact, it was a year after his death, that I was listening to the radio, travelling in my old car in South Africa, and there was a lady teaching Xhosa, which is Mandela's home language, was Mandela's home language, and she said something that riveted me to the seat, and I'm sorry I didn't know that. She said, when a leading Xhosa asks you, how's your father? It's a sign you've been accepted, you're one of the family. So that was my momentous meeting with the great Nelson Mandela. Do you know, the day after Nelson Mandela died, I got a section of newspaper headlines for various talks that I give. And I think one of the greatest headlines was our local British United Kingdom Daily Mail, because it says a colossus had fallen. Mandela, the man that taught the world the meaning of forgiveness, dies at the age of 95. And so his legacy would be one of forgiveness, and unheard of, because if you go through history, you'll see whenever one group or regime takes over from another regime, and whether it was especially an oppressive regime, there's recriminations and there's executions, there's trials. And yet Mandela brought a nation together through forgiveness and reconciliation. I don't know if you want me to expand a bit more, but forgiveness.
And is there a story that you'd like to share with us about Mandela?
Well, I think there's many stories. I think subsequent to being released, there's many stories of how he was the same with street children or Her Majesty the Queen. He was that type of person. But personally, as on the island, and anyone who watches this who is a preacher would know exactly what I'm going to say now. Sometimes you're in the middle, you've got into the point of no return in a sermon or a message to a group of people, and horrors, you realize it's totally inappropriate, and yet you can't really bail out without looking foolish, and so you stutter on to the end. I was actually speaking, P.W. Botha was president of South Africa at the time, and he never would have released Mandela. In fact, he said that as far as he's concerned, Mandela can rot in hell till I die, whoever dies earlier. And Mandela forgave him, by the way. So there was no chance of him being released at that point in time. And I was speaking about Joseph, the biblical character Joseph, being released from prison and becoming head of state under Pharaoh and saving two nations in the process, Egypt and Israel. And when I was with Nelson and Walter Sisulu and Raymond Mhlaba after that message, I said to them, guys, forgive me, and to Nelson Mandela, Nelson particularly, it was insensitive of me to be speaking of somebody being released from prison and becoming head of state and saving two nations. And Mandela looked at me as only Nelson Mandela can look at you and said, no, not at all. In fact, you give me hope. And that's the story I will cherish as long as I live. That maybe little me could give that great icon, the world's president, as one of the other newspapers said, hope in his darkest days. So that's very personal.
Mandela was released from prison early in 1990, and in April of that year, April the 16th, he appeared at Wembley Stadium to a crowd of 72,000, over 72,000. I was one of those people in that crowd. It was a big rock concert, big pop concert, but the real star, of course, was Mandela. And when he appeared, he had received an ovation that must have lasted about 10 minutes. People were just cheering and shouting, and Mandela just standing there and waving and smiling at us. And in his speech, he said some wonderful things, which I'm going to have to read to you because I can't remember them, so I'll read them to you. Through the thickness of the prison walls, we heard your voices demanding our freedom. Thank you that you chose to care. He asked for sanctions to be maintained in South Africa because there were still political prisoners in the prisons there. The most moving thing that happened, the most moving thing he said, and I still find it quite emotional when I remember it, was this. He said, "We respect you, we admire you, and above all, we love you." This was Nelson Mandela saying this to us. It was extraordinary moment. And then there was another extraordinary thing happened, which was somewhere in the corner of the stadium, people started singing "You'll Never Walk Alone." And gradually, It spread around the stadium till the whole stadium was singing that song. And if ever a football song was an appropriate thing to sing to somebody, that was it. Now I think Mandela, people say, what was Mandela's message to the world? And I think his message to the world and what he said to us on that day, we have to love and respect each other. And I think that's something we really need nowadays.
Nelson Mandela, free is Nelson Mandela, free is Nelson Mandela. Worked for change for 67